Welcome to the Parent Compass podcast, where we explore parenting themes to help our kids navigate your tween and teen years in our competitive and uncertain world. We are your co-hosts, Cindy Muchnick and Jenn Curtis, and today we are thrilled to host William Deresiewicz.
Thanks for having me on, guys. It's fun to be here.
Bill is an award-winning essayist and critic and frequent speaker at colleges, high schools, and other venues. He is the best-selling author of Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite, and The Way to a Meaningful Life. His new book, The Death of the Artist, How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of Billionaires and Big Tech, was just released this fall. Bill has published more than 250 essays in reviews and has earned several writing awards. Bill, we are so thrilled that you're joining us today.
Yeah, I'm so glad you have this podcast now. It's a great idea.
So I want to just start by reading a quote to our listeners right from the introduction of your book, Bill, on page 2 and 3. Basically the real premise of this book and a pretty heavy but potent plot point. You talk about the system of colleges in America today and the kind of grind that students go through as they pursue this, and parents as well. And you write, the system manufactures students who are smart and talented and driven, yes, but also anxious, timid, and lost, with little intellectual curiosity and a stunted sense of purpose, trapped in a bubble of privilege, heading meekly in the same direction, great at what they're doing, but with no idea why they're doing it. And that quote just sort of weighed pretty heavily on a reader as they start the journey through this book with you, which really weaves and takes us through a journey, your own personal journey and the journey of, kind of college students in America today and their families. So I just wanted to kind of share that with our listeners so they know what we're going to be talking about today. Jen, do you want to start with a question?
I have now read your book several times, and each time I read it, I find that I'm truly captivated, which is due to a variety of factors. But in part, though, I think it's due to your brutal honesty. And I think I want to start with asking if there were any repercussions to the way that you painted elite institutions.
Yeah, there were repercussions, I would say, in both directions. I mean, certainly there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of, I think, anger, especially the book came out in 2014, especially coming from representatives of those institutions or people who identified with them. In other words, sometimes students or alumni who felt implicated in a way that made them very uncomfortable. But by the same token, I heard from countless people. I continue to hear from people frequently who appreciate the brutal honesty, including like in the quote you just read, because it's really important to say what's going on. Not only so that we can maybe do something about it, but also to validate people's experiences, to validate the feelings of kids who feel trapped in the system, who feel a sense of desperation, sometimes even hopelessness, but nothing around them is validating those feelings. So they either suppress them, feel they don't have a right to them, or probably more often feel they're the only ones who are feeling that way.
You talk a lot about pursuing purpose or vocation, doing what matters, doing what feels best in your gut. And you mentioned that your major doesn't largely matter as much as your problem-solving skills. And I think that this is something that we see a lot in our respective professions. What do you say to the parent who tells his child that an English degree or a degree in music is useless and that they won't be able to financially survive?
Well, what I would say is, maybe I would put it a little nicer than this. I would say you're wrong. And you think that's true. You assume that it's true, maybe because you've always heard that it's true or because it quote unquote makes sense to you. But if you really understood how the job market works and how majors align with careers, you would know that that's false. There are many studies about this. There are many testimonials from people in business, from people who are in charge of hiring for corporations, for businesses. And what they'll tell you is that they're not primarily interested in what you major in. I mean, yes, if they're trying to fill a specific technical job, of course they are, but that's not most jobs. The statistic is that something like 70% of college graduates in the workforce are working at jobs that are not directly related to their college major. 70%. And again, most business, when they do surveys of CEOs, what they find is that it's not your major that matters to them. They care about your grades, They care about, your experience. And like you suggested, they care about whether you have the kinds of skills that are likely to help you help you have success in your career. You mentioned problem solving skills, communication skills, basically being able to think for yourself and take your own initiative. I mean, this is so important. And I've heard this from business people personally, how hard it is to find employees who can actually be left alone to self-supervise. So we can talk about how that gets developed. But I mean, first of all, liberal arts education, and liberal arts doesn't just mean English. It doesn't just mean the humanities. It actually includes the basic sciences, chemistry and physics and so forth. Liberal arts majors are designed to help you learn to think, to help you learn to teach yourself so you can be self-motivated and don't need supervision, as opposed to narrowly technical or vocational majors that teach you specific skills and procedures for doing one kind of thing. And yes, it'll be easier for you to get a job if there are jobs in that one kind of thing. But what happens 5 or 10 years later? People will tell you that within 5 or 10 years, the technical knowledge that you learned in college will be obsolete. It's sometimes the case that the whole field will be obsolete. A few years ago, the price of oil was high and students kind of rushed into major in petroleum engineering at those schools that have petroleum engineering. I wouldn't tell anyone to be a petroleum engineering major now, because in 20 years or less, we may not need any of them.
Bill, it's interesting because I'm a parent of 4. I have a recent college graduate from one of those brand name institutions that you mentioned. He was a classics American studies double major with a minor in art history. Three very humanities-based majors by his desire and his doing and what he really wanted. And he jokes because his younger brother is a business major. And he says, my younger brother will support me. I'll do what I love. And the younger one argues with him, no, I love being a business major. And they have this back and forth about humanities versus these kind of more career-driven majors. The one who is this major is now a high school English teacher. And it's just a very interesting path to have chosen. He wants to continue education because he's one of the rare ones that does love learning for learning's sake, because of, I guess, being allowed to pursue what he really enjoyed. And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back as a parent, but it was more self-driven by him. And when I read, for example, your quote on page 42 about the overbearing parents, there was, and I got an A in being a parent. These parents that want validation for doing things, a certain way. Could you comment a little bit about sort of what you've seen or heard from the students you've talked to and what they've told you about parents who have behaved badly and then parents who have allowed their kids to figure things out on their own?
I mean, look, this is the main thing that shapes what a child is going to become by the time they get to college. Not to raise the stakes, but I mean, this is what their stories embody, is how they were parented. They embody other things as well, larger than just the family. But the typical student I dealt with when I was a professor at Yale, an instructor at Columbia, at the many, many, many schools that I've talked at, are the kinds of parents who are overinvested, not in their child's happiness per se, whatever they may think about, not even in their success, if we understand success as living a fulfilled and purposeful life where you also can support yourself, but in a very, very narrow definition of success. It's all about how it reflects on them. Whether they acknowledge this or not, it's about how it reflects on them. A relatively small proportion of students have parents who not only talk the talk, as most parents do, but actually walk the walk. And when they say, do what makes you happy, I give you permission, they really mean it. And I mean, it's hard to generalize, but those students tend to have a much greater sense of inner freedom. And you can really kind of tell, you can almost tell, honestly, from the way they hold themselves, from their posture, from their body language. They're actually able to breathe and relax and be human and talk to you. So it's really, I mean, it kind of pervades every fiber of your being,
Yeah.
You're honest in the book about your own journey as it relates to what you just talked about. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I guess, it's always hardest for us to understand ourselves. And it was shockingly late in the process of writing this book that I realized just how much it applied to me, because my initial response when I started teaching at these schools in the 90s, and especially at Yale in the 2000s, is how different things were from when I was in college in the early 80s. The kids who got into Ivy League colleges in 81, when I got into college, they had like 3 AP courses and 2 or 3 extracurriculars. And here I was dealing with students who had, 12 or 13 or 15 of each. So my initial reaction was, my God, things have gone crazy since then. But looking back, I realized that I just experienced an earlier point in the same process. And I had the same kinds of expectations for my parents. My parents were immigrants. I come from a Jewish family. My father was a college professor. There was a very, very narrow definition of what I was. I mean, basically, I was supposed to go to an Ivy League school and be a doctor. Like, that's what it was. And it caused me, the truth is, it caused me to lose about 4 years, because I went into college and I immediately settled on a science major, as I was supposed to do. And by about halfway through college, I realized, like, this is not what I want to study, and this is not what I want to do. And at that point, it was too late to turn the ship around for college. So I really felt like I really wasted my chance in college. I'm not going to mince words. I really did. And I have a sense of grief about it to this day. And also, can I just say one more thing? Also, and I see this so much with kids now, because I had no sense of how to go about figuring out what I wanted, or the ability to give myself permission to do what I wanted, because it had always been doing what the grown-ups want. It took me a long time after college to find my way. It took me 4 years until I finally went back to school to study English, which is what I should have done in the first place.
Yeah. Thank you for your honesty. As Jen and I wrote The Parent Compass, we'd worked as educational consultants for many, many years. Jen still is working with high schoolers and guiding them through the college application process. But also, I had worked as a teacher and as a parent, we would be writing the book and catching ourselves saying, we need to also follow our own advice, and we need to also share our own, errors that we made along the way, because we're certainly not perfect. And there is this, mama bear that has a really difficult time, kind of letting go. And so your honesty in the journey, was really helpful for readers, I think. So we appreciate you, sharing that and kind of going back in and adding, that part of your life. And we hope that in getting your English major and now being a professional writer and all those things, that, you've made up for some of that, some of that lost time that was along the way. So we appreciate that. It's really been a great journey for us. Jen and I corresponded a lot as we reread your book and, kind of dove into some of these wonderful thought leaders that you've quoted. It's so well researched. I want to kind of go off and read all of those essays that you distilled for us, and as well as your own writing. So thank you for introducing us to more of these ideas.
Yeah, can I just say one thing, Jen, for a second? Obviously, parents are going to be deeply invested in their kids' well-being. And of course, I'm not suggesting they shouldn't be. I think one way to think about it is to think about the time horizon. Like, what parents are focused on is, what's going to happen to my kid when they're 18? They need to get into the most highly ranked school they can. Like, life doesn't stop at age 18. And if you want your kid to have a well-being and a longer time horizon throughout their adult life, which of course you do, you need to think about that first moment differently, right? Because that's really what you care about. You don't really care that they get into X or Y school. You care that in the long term, they're going to be good, they're going to be okay. And I care about that too for kids. That requires a really different way of thinking, unfortunately, and a really different approach and a really different strategy.
So your book, one thing that I started thinking about as I was rereading it is that your book came out nearly 7 years ago. And so this was clearly way pre-Varsity Blues. And I imagine that when the events of March 2019 went down, you probably were not very surprised. So I just wanted to ask you about that and get your thoughts on not necessarily the whole Varsity Blues, but just I would love to just kind of hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I actually did a short segment on MSNBC when it came out. And what I said was, obviously this is appalling. It's not surprising, but most importantly, it can't trick us into thinking that these are the parents that are the problem. This is just the most extreme version of basically business as usual. It was an illegal form of bribery. There's a legal form of bribery where you just donate a lot of money to a school. It was an illegal form of using your wealth to give your child an advantage. Most of the selective college admissions process is about legal ways of using your wealth to give your children an advantage. So they weren't rigging the system, these parents. The system is already rigged. And as you know from my book, what I say in the last part of the book is, I take a wider view. I've talked about kids, I've talked about colleges, and then I talk about how all this works within a larger society. What's the bigger picture here? And the bigger picture is that the college admissions process has become a way for financially advantaged families to pass on their financial advantage to the detriment of everybody else, but also to the detriment of their kids. Because unlike the old days 100 years ago, where if you were born into the WASP aristocracy, the red carpet was rolled out for you and you went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, now the kids have to work constantly from a very young age to launder that privilege. But it's the money that their parents have that enable them to do that.
I love on 64 how you give a shout out to the schools that you describe as kind of lower down on the list, even the religious colleges or schools many of us have never heard of that don't make any sort of a list. And your genuine belief that they offer actually a better education than some of these fancier schools because of the way that they educate. Could you comment? You made that comment about, kind of comparing these types of schools. And I wanted more of that. I'm curious if you have any other thoughts relating to it. Let me refresh your memory. You say that no more than in high schools are students equipped to address the larger questions of meaning and purpose about their education and lives that come so inevitably in young adulthood. Religious colleges, quite frankly, even obscure regional schools that no one's ever heard of on the coast often do a much better job in that respect. And you spend a lot of time kind of talking about soul and trying to find a real education and what that looks like instead of just jumping through hoops. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
I'd be happy to. I mean, first of all, let me say, I'm not saying in a blanket way that, obscure schools are better than fancy ones. What I'm saying is that there's not much correlation between the prestige of a school and the quality of the kind of education I'm talking about. I mean, yes, you may get a very technocratic education at a fancy school, but if we're talking about what I call building a soul, let's say developing a self, let's say growing up, finding a sense of purpose, the fancy schools can often really be bad places to do that, precisely because the students are still elbowing each other to be the first ones over the hurdle, right? There's a new set of shining goals now for post-college, and they're all fighting each other to get that. And smaller schools, sometimes they're religious schools. I mean, lots of religious schools are no doubt not good places to go. But religious schools often take these things more seriously precisely because they're religious schools. Non-religious schools that are liberal arts colleges, again, in all of these sectors, there's a huge variety. So I'm not making any blanket recommendations, but small liberal arts colleges, and again, often not the most prestigious ones, not the top 10 or 20. Again, another reason why is that unlike the fancy schools, the faculty tend to be more incentivized to spend their time as teachers rather than researchers and scholars. That's another very big point of it, because I think essential to that process is that relationship with faculty. And at a fancy school that also is a research university, you may often have literally no personal contact with faculty.
You touch a lot on risk and failure. I loved the one quote of Laura Galinsky's mom where you say, "Fear means go." And throughout the book, you talk about how risk averse our young people are and how our system is influencing that. Can you talk about risk taking and failing and why they're so essential to develop?
Right. So first of all, think about it. We've set up a system where kids get the message that if they get, one A- in their high school career, their chances, right? So of course they're going to be completely risk averse. And other people have taught, I imagine you've talked about this or will talk about this, just the general culture of parenting, like physical safety, that's become intensely risk averse. So let's use that analogy. I mean, people now, I think there's growing consciousness that if, for example, you never challenge your child's immune system, they won't develop much of an immune system and they'll have all these allergies, right? I mean, that's what builds, if you never go to the gym and lift weights, you will never develop any muscle strength. I mean, this is what develops our strength, our resilience, our ability to meet challenges is by taking on challenges. And a challenge is by definition risky. It wouldn't be a challenge otherwise if you're only ever doing things that you already knew how to do. And that's academic. It's also just sort of psychological, right? In other words, doing things that make you uncomfortable, doing things that make your parents uncomfortable. I mean, doing things that you're just really uncertain about, right? These are all things that sort of there isn't room for in the way we kind of structure childhood and adolescence now. Every activity is like, even if it's hard, it's like structured, it's skill building activity. And there's, and your mom drives you to it. So, the kid who sort of explores on their own, whether it's a literal exploration or just an intellectual or creative exploration. I mean, Cindy, you talked earlier about your eldest and you said it all came from him. He was self-driven. That's the way it should be. I think almost all kids are going to be self-driven if they're given the chance to. I mean, in some ways, that's what's both so infuriating to me about this, but also so hopeful. Is like, we don't need to teach kids to explore. We don't need to teach them to be creative, to be curious. We need to teach them not to do those things. And we do a very good job of that now. But all we have to do is kind of take the lid off and the kid will flourish. Yeah.
So I want to wrap up a little bit because I know we're going to get close to our time. I want to wrap up on something maybe a more positive kind of takeaway note, which is on page 87 of your book. You talk about, quote, what makes you interesting is reading, thinking, slowing down, having long conversations, and creating a rich inner life for yourself. And do you think students in colleges today don't do that? Because I recall when I got to college, this feeling of, oh my God, I have all this time. I'm not programmed from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. I have a class that meets twice a week or a class that meets once a week. And I have a big block of time to do my laundry or do an activity or stay up really late having a hallway conversation. And I do remember the fun parts, not talking about the partying and all of that as much as just the connections and the enriching things that don't happen in the classroom. And I know, putting COVID aside, because that's just a totally different ball of wax and world right now. But do you feel that you didn't see enough students enjoying? I mean, am I sort of remembering like a sugar-coated version? Because I really did feel a sense of enjoyment and of that those conversations did happen and a richness and a talking about the books you were reading because you wanted to at dinner, not because you were writing a paper on it.
When did you start college?
I'm not that much younger than you. I was 88 to 92.
Well, there you go. That was over 30 years ago.
Right.
The answer to the question, do I really not see students doing that, is like, I really don't see students doing that now. I mean, talking about the books that they've read, they haven't read the books. Okay, let's just start with that, because they don't have time. Because that cycle of endless hoop jumping that starts probably in junior high school, if not earlier, that students have said this to me, when I get to college, or maybe freshman advisees who I see their first week of college, now it's all going to be different. It's not different. First of all, that's how they've been trained. That's what they know how to do. But also the same, as I suggested earlier, the same competitiveness reproduces itself in college just for the next stage. And so students now, I mean, if anything, they may be busier in college than they are in high school. They don't have parents telling them to stop. They don't have parents calling them to family activities. They don't maybe have parents making sure they get enough sleep. And so absolutely, it is just an incessant chase from one. I mean, students literally showing up to office hours out of breath because they're just running from, and then do they have the time to have the kind of conversation I wanted to have with them in office hours? Usually not. The ones who did what you said were the ones who felt like freaks, the ones who felt like, I'm out of place here.
Yeah.
This was at Yale. This was a place that's supposed to be very intellectual.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Part of me, I don't want to be old fashioned about it. And it is, I look at all these years of, working with students and feeling like college is the reward in a lot of ways. That 4 years is the reward for a lot of really hard work. I remember telling students, I think high school is way harder than college is in a lot of ways, of what's expected of you and your time. And you get to college and should be a feeling of breath and liberation and, an opportunity to make some of your own choices that aren't quite as dictated for you. I mean, every high schooler waits for senior year to get to take their electives. And I guess that sort of happens in college now too, unless I remember getting advice, take as many introductory courses as you can in college, because expose yourself to anthropology and sociology and, whatever the topics are that maybe you'll never explore again, because if you don't do it in these 4 years, unless you go take a class online as an adult, you're not going to do it. So I still try in maybe a romanticized way to encourage that of the families and the students that I, have connected with through the years. But it is, it's a sad commentary of what it's come to. And I hope that readers of your book, walk away with some better tools, even in how to parent when they read sort of the damage that has been caused and done by the students who arrive at some of these places. So yeah, I don't know. Jenn, do you have any concluding thoughts on?
Just thank you so much for joining us. This is honestly, like I said, I've read your book several times, and every time I read it, I take away something new. And it's so well written. It's so well researched. So I hope our listeners go out, if they haven't read it yet, and that they will read it. Excellent Sheep. Bill, can you tell us where they can find you?
Yes, can I just say one thing first? It's a book that was written for parents, but it was primarily written for kids, for young adults. So for a junior or senior in high school, or for someone who's a first or second year student in college, or anywhere around that time frame, this is a book for them, okay? You can find me on my website. I know my last name is hard to spell. If you can spell my last name, the good thing is that there are very few people with my last name. So just type it into Google and you'll get my website and you can find me there. And I love to hear from people. There's a contact me link there. I love to hear from people.
And everyone, please check out Bill's new book, brand new book, The Death of the Artist, How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of Billionaires and Big Tech. Also a really incredibly deep topic and very timely as well. And we're just so grateful for your time, your insights, your honesty, and just what you've shared. I mean, it's a very cathartic experience, I think, to read your book. It's very, it makes you want to do better. It makes you want to kind of change. It makes you frustrated, but it also is something that I really think sparks such important dialogue. So thank you for what you're doing, what you continue to do, and